Hello, I'm Samantha Brandfon, the Emergency Manager for the VA Ann Arbor Healthcare System. Imagine there is a fire, a tornado, or hazardous material spill impacting your work area, or perhaps a network, communication, or utility outage. Do your staff know what your initial action should be? If your team was presented with a life-threatening or significant emergency, would your response be delayed? How you practice is how you play. The Do It program is an opportunity to practice your team's response and determine areas for improving your team's readiness. For a real-world example of the significance of practice, in May 2011, St. John's Mercy Hospital in Joplin, Missouri experienced a direct hit from an ESF5 tornado. Windows and walls were blown out, portions of the roof were pulled off, their building infrastructure was severely damaged. You can see an image of the destruction here in these before and after photos. St. John's Mercy Hospital evacuated 183 patients from their grounds in 90 minutes, which was an incredibly fast response. The hospital experienced 7 casualties as a result of the tornado. But the interesting question is, what caused their deaths? Many of us would imagine they died of trauma related to the tornado itself, building collapse, etc. In truth, only one person died of blunt force trauma. The other 6 died due to suffocation because their ventilators were impacted by the power outage and there was a lack of mobile ventilators. If the staff of St. John's had not regularly practiced their tornado response and evacuation procedures, significantly more lives could have been lost. How you practice is how you play. Right now, you're probably thinking, that sounds great and all, but everyone has demands on their time. When will we ever have time to practice like this? What if I could tell you that your team could significantly improve their readiness in as little as 15 minutes a month? Each month, a different hazard will be featured in the Do It program. The Do It guides may be completed during a staff meeting for widest staff participation, or they may be completed in smaller groups as staff are available. Each guide should only require 5 to 10 minutes to complete with your staff and an additional 5 to 10 minutes for the supervisor to complete the forms and return to the emergency manager. These are not intended to be punitive, rather purely educational moments so that staff have a low-stress learning environment to consider emergency preparedness. If staff required coaching to get to a correct answer, that's okay. Real-time coaching should be provided if staff are unaware of their required immediate actions. Indicating that coaching was required is important to properly gauge the healthcare system's level of preparedness and to determine additional training and informational session needs. The cumulative analysis of the facility-wide response to these guides will be reported to the Emergency Management Committee for ongoing emergency management program prioritization, planning, and improvement. Let's take a look at an example together. This Do It guide focuses upon fire response. At the top of the page, you'll simply complete the sections regarding your service or unit, date and time of the completion of the activity, the facilitator or observer of the guide, and the number of participants who completed the activity. The bulk of the guide is the question and answer portion. You'll notice that the questions are in bold and the answers are in italics below. You'll begin by addressing your team with a question. Let's use the first one as an example. Do you know where the closest fire pull station is in your workspace? How might you otherwise notify building or area occupants? You can see that the answer in italics below indicates that you, the supervisor, must be able to correctly identify the closest pull station. This is because the guide is designed to be applicable across all areas of the facility and the pull station locations will vary across areas. However, you'll see that there are some other questions and answers that are pretty straightforward. So for example, what does the acronym PASS stand for or RACE stand for? And you'll see that those are standard answers in those sections. So the supervisor will not have to do any additional effort to identify the correct answer. So back to this first question. You'll want to give your team the opportunity to answer the question on their own without providing the answer to them. This is not intended to be a let's rattle through these question and answers together. This is supposed to be where staff are actively thinking about the questions and coming up with an appropriate response. So if staff are able to collectively answer the question without any coaching or prompting from you, you'll mark an X in the first column. Correct response without coaching? Yes. And that's great. And then at that point, you're welcome to add any action taken or comments to the section to the right, or you can simply proceed to the next question. If they are unable to answer the question on their own, helping one another out, you'll want to begin by marking an X in the next column, which is correct response without coaching. No, they weren't able to do it on this particular question. And then at that point, you'll want to provide them some helpful coaching to get them to the correct answer. So for this example, you may suggest, do you see any signage that might help you identify this location? If after this coaching, they are then able to answer this question, you can mark an X in the next column, which is correct response with coaching, yes. You'll see that I did not delete this first X because the status didn't change. They weren't able to answer that first question without coaching, but they were able to answer it with coaching, so we'll just add an X here. If you have any actions taken or comments, you might want to add that into this section here, but otherwise, you'd move on to the next question. However, if you've provided this additional coaching and your team is still unable to answer this question, you'll mark an X in the with coaching no section. Again, leaving this first without coaching no X remaining in the box. At this point, you definitely would want to add actions taken and or comments. So again, do you know where the closest fire pole station is in your area, and how might you otherwise notify building or area occupants? So for this, you'll want to do a corrective action on the spot. And so you'll say something like provided location of the closest pole station. And you'll want to say what that might be. So that might be near stairwell 8, for example. And at that point, you'll move on to the next question. This guide continues in similar fashion and includes a section that may have more relevance to areas which provide direct patient care. You'll see that this top section says all areas. That's because everybody in the facility, these are applicable to those areas. And then there's a section lower that says patient care areas. And these areas, again, may be more relevant for those services that provide direct patient care. For staff and patient care areas, they should complete both the all areas and patient care areas section. For the right-hand portion of the guide, the exercise facilitator will generally want to indicate the staff involved. So for example, in this first section, you may say RNs, MSAs, social workers, etc. So whomever from your service may have participated in that day's exercise. The next section is a mini after action review, which will be used to elaborate on areas which were successful or areas that may require improvements for your team. Remember, the focus is on learning and it's not punitive in nature. So if you learned that perhaps your team required more education on evacuation procedures, you'll want to include that on this form. But we'll start with success because I believe a lot of services will have great success in many of these areas. So we'll want to highlight those. So for areas of success for this particular event, we might want to say staff were able to correctly identify race and pass. And that might be just one example of the things that your staff is doing already very well without this exercise. Under areas needing improvement, again, if your staff are maybe needing a little bit more education on evacuation procedures, you'll want to indicate that on this form. So you'll also want to indicate your plans to implement those actions. So let's talk about this. Maybe your staff need additional training on evacuation procedures, including use of evacu sleds, which are the under the bed evacuation equipment, and evacu chairs, which are wall mounted, essentially wheelchairs that can help you evacuate somebody that's non-ambulatory down flights of stairs. So those may be some areas that need improvement, but then you have to come up with an action to improve those areas. So for example here, you might say unit educator to provide in service on use of evacuation equipment and procedures. And because this is something that you're wanting to focus on implementing this in a timely fashion, you'll want to give some kind of timeline for this. So we might say you'll have the unit educator provide this in service by July 1st, 2016. This last section, the results of performance improvement, is to be tracked and monitored by the facilitator of the exercise and does not need to be completed before it's initially submitted to the emergency manager. You can use this portion to determine whether your team has improved in their learning and readiness once you have implemented your identified actions needing improvement. Again, for this case, it might be whether your staff achieved increased knowledge on the use of evacuation equipment after they received their training. Now, once this is complete, you'll enter the name of the facilitator of the exercise, you'll sign, and you'll date, and you'll email a scanned copy of this form and your staff sign-in sheet to me, and my contact information is enclosed on the bottom of every Do-It guide. Thank you for viewing this video on the purpose and implementation of the Do-It program. If you have any additional questions about this program or about emergency preparedness, please contact me using the information on the screen.